All right, so for this week, I'm going to pick a topic each day, kind of a theme as it comes to books. And then I'm going to make a couple suggestions either in ways to approach that theme or a couple actual book suggestions. You can't see my desk right now, but it's stacked with different books and topics. So first one we will bring over. Now, if you saw the little intro, the first one was History of the Church, church history. And some of you are like, oh my God, whatever. Get used to it. Going to give you a couple options, something you can think about, some ideas. If you are interested in history of the church or different, where do I go with that? So here are a couple options. So some people want kind of widespread stuff. So for example, there's this guy named Jurgens, and he put out a couple volumes of this, and it's called The Faith of the Early Fathers. So as you know, the scriptures are kind of the first history. So from the Old Testament, the history of Israel, into the history of the church in the New Testament and Jesus Christ. And then you kind of move out from there to the apostles. And we have some of their writings that we put together in the scriptures that we know as the Bible, these books, letters. And then after that, we have the writings of the people who followed right after them. A lot of times people just forget about them and shove them off, and it's like, no, this is important. All the things nowadays, think of our judicial system or things like that. They'll come in, if they have questions about how to interpret the Constitution, where do they go? Well, they say, let's look at some of these secondary sources. Let's look at the Federalist Papers. Let's look and see what they wrote to each other. How can we begin to understand this more? Let's look at previous cases and see how other people have understood these from the beginning. And so why would we not do that with something else? And so that is what we do and have access to. We have all these documents from the very beginning, right after the apostles, and how they interpreted what was passed on to them. So anyway, Jurgens puts together the Faith of the Early Fathers. And in the back, they have, what's good about these is they have doctrinal indexes. So for example, you can go to baptism or Mary or the sacraments or confirmation, and it gives you and points out the different times in history where some of these fathers have talked about it. So for example, here there are 3 nice color-coded copies of those. So that's kind of a general history. Some of us may go after, for example, that's more of a compendium. So this is an example. Jimmy Akin put one, The Fathers Know Best. And he does something similar, but he boils it down and he has it by topic. And you can go through and look, and he has different maps, and it's well put together. There's a couple of these. Willis, Jesuit, put one similar. So you can find a few of these out there. But this is more the compendium that you can kind of take and look back through. Now, some may go to something more specific. So for example, here's a little book called The Four Witnesses. And so they pick out something more specific. And this is the early church in her own words. So it picks the 4: Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Justin Martyr, and begins to put that in narrative form. So you might find something more interesting like that. Now you may even go more specific, and you want to look into periods of church history and pick out topic-specific things. So I've talked to you last week, for example, about what I want to know what it was like to be a Christian and right after becomes legal. So there's a series, for example, Ancient Christian Writers, and this is the one I told you last week about Egeria. Well, they have other ancient Christian writings, for example, the martyrdom of Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch and his martyrdom, the ones I mentioned, the Clement of Rome, the 4th Bishop of Rome, and his letters that he writes to Corinth and different things, and it puts them in here and gives you commentary. So you can read and say, okay, what were the first Christians reading and practicing and celebrating? Finally, you may want to jump out a little further and pick a particular topic in history. So, for example, take the Crusades. You may jump into look for Concise Histories. So Madden is a professor, and so he writes, I think he's at St. Louis University, and so he takes, you can see it's not super thick, and he tries to give concise histories of different particular topics. So maybe the Inquisition or the Crusades or councils. Maybe these are things that interest you. So find something topic-oriented. This one's not too long. And you can jump in and see what's going on. For example, the Council of Trent and Vatican II, O'Malley, he writes some that are pretty succinct, and for the most part, they're pretty good. There are concise histories of the Catholic Church, some that are more bombastic, like Triumph or some that are more, what do they call it? The popular histories that are more condensed. So I encourage you, find a topic that you like, something that interests you. If there's, it's a nice resource to have, for example, the 3-volume, and I can look and say, oh, what am I interested in? And find what the earliest Christians were writing and saying about it. It gives us context for what we see. We don't live in a bubble. We're not a Christian island, but we go back and we are inheritors of a tradition that Jesus Christ gave something to his disciples, and those disciples passed on these things to us. And so let's go back to the very beginning and see what they thought. All right, so those are some book suggestions on church history today, and we'll see you here tomorrow for the next theme.